Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Today, just a second. Sorry. Today we have people from different countries. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michela De Camillis. I'm Sales and Project Engineer at GreenSoil. Today, Jan van de Olen, Business Development Manager of GreenSoil, is going to talk about the feasibility to combine redevelopment and remediation. Jan will present some of our cases and lessons learned where bioengineering and total remediation contracting has unlocked redevelopment issues at brownfield sites. He will describe the remediation approaches we use and the latest monitoring results. Jan's presentation will last about 45 minutes, after which there will be time left for questions and answers. You can write your question in the chat box anytime during the presentation, and Jan will answer them when his presentation will be concluded. If you have any other question that comes up afterwards, email us and we will come back to you with the answer. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available by email to all registered users. Now, I kindly ask you to turn off your mic and camera and enjoy your webinar. As I don't have anything further, I'm going to hand over to Jan.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're having some small technical issues, but it seems like they are resolved at the moment. I'm going to be sharing my screen and then, okay, give me a second. Here we go. I'm hoping the feedback will be resolved at this moment, and I want to thank you all for joining today. It seems that we do have quite some people in the webinar today. We also had quite a lot of registrations, and I'm pleased to see that some people decided to log in and not go outside or have a beer outside, because for those not in Belgium or the Netherlands, this is one of the first few days that we really got some nice weather. So I appreciate your time and taking time to call in today. During this webinar today, we will be discussing the multi-technique remediation projects in combination with the redevelopment of contaminated site. We will start off with a quick introduction about GreenSoil Group, which I will try to keep quite short. And then I will go further with an introduction and address the topic of the day. So who are we? We consider ourselves to be a specialized, innovative and international remediation contractor. We were founded in 2016. At the moment, we are about 28 staff, a lot of people with many years of experience.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I can't see your screen.
Not?
No.
Okay.
I don't know if others are having the same issue.
No, I can see your face there, mate.
Any other people having this issue of not seeing the screen, or?
Now, yes. Please.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
All right. So we are about 28 people, and we have offices in Belgium, the Netherlands, Brazil, Chile, and Italy. We are a general contractor and take on all types of works, but we are specialized in in-situ and on-site soil remediation. We specialize in bioremediation techniques, as we will explain further today. We have a strong focus on R&D, and we try to incorporate sustainability in all of our projects. And as we are a small company, we pride ourselves on being able to really be client-oriented. And this is showcases in our result-driven contracting, alternative contracting forms, and client site-specific and tailor-made solutions. We have been presenting webinars about this topic more in detail in the past. So if there's any questions about these type of topics, we kindly refer to our previous webinars, and you can always reach out to have some discussions. At the moment, we have several ongoing projects, and we have been doing projects in about 12 countries. This is an overview of where we have some of our full-scale projects going on. As you can see, it's a nice mixture. of projects all around the world, and this is being reflected also by the audience today. So welcome to everybody from all around the world. The content for the webinar today, I'll kick off with a small introduction. Then we'll explain why we focus on bioremediation, what we consider to be bioremediation, and how we as GreenSoil implement bioremediation. And then we will revisit some cases, a project in Mechelen in Belgium and a project in Geel in Belgium. Both projects which have been focused on integrating redevelopment and remediation, as well in specific contracting types, of which we will not discuss today. But these projects have been revisited, have been the topic of previous webinars as well. Today we will be revisiting them, and we will be showcasing you the latest results of these topics. But we will try to put a more focus on how we were able to integrate the remediation and the redevelopment. So as I said, this webinar, it will have a focus on the redevelopment and integration of bioremediation techniques, but we also thought it would be useful to have a more back to basics webinar. So some of our previous webinars were really quite detailed, could be considered expert classes. We have some webinars presented by Jean Dijk, where we really go in all the nitty-gritty details about which reactions are taking place, quite detailed chemical, biological details, sometimes maybe too scientific for some of the audience. And today we opted to take a few steps back and try to look at it with a more broader picture. So if you consider yourself to be already up to speed, the upcoming 20 minutes might be a bit too easy. But we hope to be able to provide you all with some lessons learned and to provide you with some valuable feedback. For our previous webinars, we really do like to point out that all our webinars are being recorded and are available on YouTube. So should the weather get a bit worse again, you can always fill up rainy days by watching them on YouTube. So, redevelopment of contaminated sites. I think most people attending this webinar today have been facing these type of projects in the past as well. And as you all will know, these projects often come with a specific set of challenges rather. Soil and groundwater remediation is always quite a tricky field. We always are dealing with a limited data set. Try to implement the design based on this data, but when we are also throwing a redevelopment in the mix, things could get quite challenging. We see challenges related to the contamination. So as I said earlier, limited data sets, they are inherent to soil and groundwater investigations. Thing that I'd like to point out here is that we often notice that there's a difference in the contractor versus the consultant. The scope of the works of a consultant is often more or less focused on delineating the contamination, making sure how far it has spread, how deep it has spread, and it's not always focused on clearly investigating the severity of the contamination within the source area. Often this source area is what is being the most interesting to us as a contractor. We always also understand that just in almost every sector, I think budgets are under stress. So we also understand how we are sometimes lacking some data. But the thing that we do like to point out to the consultants present in this webinar today is that it's really useful to have some detailed investigation and data from the contamination within the source area available as well. We think about identification of smear zones, delineation of smear zones, several pure product measurements, things like that. I think they always help in characterizing contamination and in developing a remedial action plan and how to deal with the remediation. Then, redevelopment projects always come with several stakeholders. Each stakeholder usually also has its own financial and legal boundary conditions. So these make up for even more complex contracting forms. And then I think almost each redevelopment project is requires you to have a good management of change, changing of the permitting, the redevelopment plans, locations of, for instance, basements or where buildings will be erected, things like that. They change all of the time, and it usually requires us as a remedial contractor to adjust our remedial plan and to adjust our scope of works as well. And it's the integration of these remediation works within this redevelopment that is often the biggest challenge, and where we try to be as flexible as possible. And it's something that will be showcased later on in the projects as well. So why do we choose for bioremediation? This slide has been presented in the past already quite a few times. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I do want to focus that bioremediation or biological remediation is a robust technology. So once you have the projects of the processes related to the degradation of the contaminant mass ongoing, once you create the right boundary conditions, you are quite certain that this process will be ongoing as long as you make sure that the boundary conditions are okay. On the other hand, it's also a cost-effective treatment solution. So often when we don't have a clear picture of how big a source area is or how much contaminant mass is really present, once you have these boundary conditions ongoing and you have the biological degradation ongoing, you will see that costs related to treating more kilos of contaminated mass are not resulting in a linear increase of your cost related to remediation. So for a biological remediation, you usually have a bigger cost at the startup, but once a project is ongoing, this more or less flattens out, and this is in big contrast with the more chemical, physical, or the pump and treat remediation types. And then also bioremediation is a more sustainable approach of remediation. As you can see in the graphs on your right, you will have the tons of CO2 production by 3 different treatment methods of a contaminated soil. Moving to the next slide, what is bioremediation? And I think we have several ways of explaining this. If you look at the more chemical approach, we can have several pathways that we distinguish. We have the aerobic degradation or the anaerobic degradation. The way I try to explain it when I'm having a drink somewhere and people are asking me, okay, Jan, what is your job? And then I always try to explain, okay, we are working, we are dealing with contaminants, and we are stimulating the biological degradation, and it can happen in 2 ways, aerobically or anaerobically. When the aerobic pathway is taking place, then we have microorganisms who are breaking down the contaminants, who are respiring oxygen just as we are, and they are producing carbon dioxide, energy, and biomass. In the anaerobic pathway, it's the other way around. Those organisms, they are not breathing oxygen, but they are breathing the contaminants. So in this case, the electron acceptor is the contaminants, and the electron donor is the organic substrate that we usually are injecting. So it could be molasses, lactate, or our own DHaloGS. And then the products which are being formed are ethene, ethane, carbon dioxide, and as well the energy and the biomass. And especially this biomass is quite important here, because the more biomass we are creating and are generating, the more we are forming more microorganisms, and we are accelerating the biodegradation process. So the focus on this biomass is quite important. If we look at the aerobic bioremediation, we are usually looking at compounds such as hydrocarbons, mineral oils, the low chlorinated compounds, alcohol, ethers, and so on. These products often have a density lower than 1 and have the tendency to float above the groundwater table. So they have the tendency to form L-napples. And with changes in the groundwater table, you get a typical smear zone. So a layer surrounding the groundwater, the natural fluctuations of the groundwater table, where you really have a dense contaminated mass presence. As a rule of thumb for the degradation process, as we said earlier, you need the biomass and you need the oxygen as well as nutrients, but those are required for forming the biomass. But often oxygen is a limiting factor here. We use the rule of thumb that we require about 2 grams of oxygen for each gram of oil, which needs to be broken down. So I think that also provides you with some rules of thumb on how to assess how much oxygen one would need to be able to biodegrade a certain contaminant. When we're looking at the anaerobic bioremediation, we are typically looking at the chlorinated compounds such as the perchloroethylene, trichloroethylene, and so on. These parameters are fairly water soluble and mobile, so they have the tendency to form the large contaminated plumes. We will see 2 project examples later on. These contaminants also usually have a density above 1, and as such are more heavy than water and have the tendency to migrate further downwards and have the tendency or the possibility to accumulate and form a D-napple, so the presence of pure product at greater depths. To make sure that the degradation of these parameters can take place, we need to create the optimal redox conditions, and one does need to dose the electron donor, which will be serving as a carbon and an electron source. So one of the possible pathways, the most typical and most known one, the reductive dechlorination, is being presented in this simple graph below, where you will see the elimination of 1 chlorine atom at each step. However, in reality, bioremediation is much more complex than we often consider. So we usually have different processes which are taking place at the same time due to the heterogeneity. These heterogeneities can be related to conditions, for instance, different soil layers, but also heterogeneity related to the contamination. And the thing is that often we don't know for sure what is really going on. We are usually observing some concentrations of contaminant mass, also the daughter products, also some of the other geochemical conditions, and in most cases there will be a combination of biological and non-biological processes which are taking place. So as you can see in the illustration on the right, this is the possible degradation pathways of known CVOC, the 1,1,1,3-chloroethane, and possible pathways for degradations include an abiotic pathway, being that it's just a non-biological process. Could be a dehydrochlorination, could be a hydrolysis. Then you have an aerobic pathway where you can have just regular degradation, could also be a co-metabol degradation, and then you could have an anaerobic pathway. And in reality, all these different pathways are taking place by different microorganisms under different geochemical conditions. And what you really want to create is see which pathway you want to stimulate, which is the most effective, which will have the fastest results, the fastest degradation, and try to create the optimal conditions for this pathway. And that is more or less where the science kicks in and how we try to see, okay, what are the possibilities? How do we do this? And I call it here the green soil approach, but I think everybody looking at bioremediation more or less has the same approach. The first phase, I like to call it the assessment. In the first line of evidence, we try to see, okay, are we already observing some degradation? A quite easy example is the contamination with the perchloroethylene. If you know that this is the mother product, then you just take samples and you observe, okay, do we already have presence of trichloroethylene, dichloroethylene, vinyl chloride, ethene, and so on. If that's the case, then you know that, okay, we have degradation going on. How can we accelerate this? How can we stimulate this? And how can we make sure that we achieve the target results? If we are not observing this degradation, it could have several reasons. The most often second line of evidence and verifying what the possibilities are checking the geochemical boundary conditions. These are also quite well known, checking pH, checking redox, checking the presence of oxygen, nitrate, sulfate concentrations, TOC, DOC. These are all typical parameters which can point you in the right direction why maybe degradation is not yet taking place. It's also something that I often explain to people who are not in this business. When they ask me, okay, how do you make sure that the certain conditions are met? If you see that, for instance, the trichloroethylene is not breaking down, but you're still observing, for instance, some nitrate concentrations, the way I like to compare or explain, for instance, to my wife is like saying, okay, the perchloroethylene, it's like the broccolis on the plate of our children. And as long as there's still some nitrates, which are like fries, for instance, the fries, they will be eaten first. And in the end, you will make sure that they will also eat the broccolis, but the fries will be the one to disappear at the first time. So that's more or less also what's happening here. We are trying to create the right conditions where we will have no longer the nitrates and the sulfates as the limiting factors. And that's when you can create the right boundary conditions that the degradation that you're aiming at, being the degradation of your chlorinated ethenes, is taking place. And you have these scenarios. This is an example for the anaerobic degradation, but you have similar pathways for aerobic degradation, and that's more or less how you try to make the puzzle. The assessment is usually enough for parameters where we have hands-on experience. So for the typical hydrocarbons, the mineral oils for the aerobic pathways, or the CVOCs for the anaerobic pathways, we usually are able to design a remediation system based on these data. When you are looking at new contaminants and parameters where we are not so familiar with, we usually we usually also include a feasibility study. During this feasibility study, we are investigating in literature and maybe also working together with research centers like universities, and where we try to see, okay, what are the possibilities? And then we also include, for instance, molecular analysis, identify whether or not certain bacteria which are being described in the literature are present, whether or not certain key enzymes needed to achieve the degradation or achieve the reaction are present. We could also opt for the typical lab tests. I think some of you may also be familiar with those, where you try to stimulate or recreate a certain scenario within the aquifer by dosing contaminants to a certain amount of soil and groundwater, and see how which reactions are taking place. Or you could opt to include a field or a pilot test to assess the possibilities on site. Once phase 1 is completed and we expect that biodegradation is a possibility, we move to the design phase of the project. one thing that we cannot stress enough is that a thorough understanding of the conceptual site model is key within this. It's also key when you're investigating or when you're delineating contamination, when you're identifying risks related to a contamination, but it's also key when you're designing a remediation system. So you need thorough understanding of the contamination, the geology, the hydrogeology, and the geochemical boundary conditions, as I explained earlier on. You also need to know what are the boundary conditions which are being imposed by the redevelopment, by the stakeholders, and timing-wise. And then based on this information, you are able to select a remediation technique, or in case of remediation combined with redevelopment, often a combination of techniques. And then you will start, once you have selected your technique, you will be filling it out and going into a detailed design. Things that we often see is, for instance, a combination of an excavation of source areas together with an in situ approach, or for instance, in combination with a pump and treat and a soil vapor extraction for smear zones, followed by an in situ approach. These treatment trains or combination of techniques are often useful for redevelopments, because in this case you can meet often the imposed timing criterion. So it's not that the full-on bioremediation would not be possible, but when you are able to take away a certain contaminant mass and within a short time frame, I think that's always to be preferred within a remediation or the redevelopment project. One thing that we do like to point out as well is that throughout our first design phase, we often schedule a budget for additional source zone investigations. So as I said earlier, we often find that during the investigation phase, not enough focus has been put on delineating or investigating the source zone, or we don't have all the geochemical properties examined enough, and that's when during this design phase, that we do these additional investigations. I want to take this moment to explain some more common remediation or bioremediation techniques and how we implement them in practice here within GreenSoil. Of course, we implement much more techniques, but I think the following three ones are the most common ones. The first one is the aerobic biopiling, and it's can be considered as an alternative to the typical soil treatment centers. So in this case, we are treating the soil on location. We are excavating them, and we are creating the optimal conditions for aerobic biodegradation within these biopiles. Within this slide, in this figure, you can see some typical layout of how we build up such a biopile. So as you can see, it's a layer of clean soil upon which we install a drainage package. Then you will have a biopile with contaminated soil upon there. And the thing is, we are extracting air throughout the biopile. So we are not blowing air through it. We are sucking out air through the biopile, and as such forcing the oxygen to enter the biopile. Of course, the contaminated air which is being exfiltrated out of the biopile is being treated before being discharged. The more or less same processes are taking place or can take place in situ, and that's when we use that's what we call the in situ enhanced aerobic bioremediation. In this case, we are treating the groundwater. We are injecting air, and we are recirculating contaminated water, extracting it on one hand, adding air and nutrients, infiltrating it on the other side, and as such treating the water above ground in the bioreactor but also creating a large in situ bioreactor in situ. So that's the more or less, it's the same processes which are taking place at the aerobic biodegradation, but instead of doing it on top and excavating the soil, in this case we are treating the groundwater in situ. The final typical green soil remediation technique is the in situ enhanced anaerobic bioremediation. And in this case, we are also opting for the recirculation. So we are extracting and infiltrating water to flush the contaminated volume in the aquifer. But we are not dosing oxygen in this case, but in this case, we are dosing the electron donor. As an electron donor, we have developed our in-house DHaloGS carbon source. It's a carbon and nutrient source which enhances biodegradation. It could be dosed by also direct push injection, but we like to use groundwater recirculations because of the forced flushing of the aquifer. Also think that this is a technique that most people present in this webinar are quite familiar with, but it's the one where we really have good results with. And one of the benefits of the DHaloGS, it has also been explained in previous webinars, is that you won't observe the typical pH drop due to the nature of the product that we have developed. The phase 2 design to build further on how we design a remediation system once we have selected the preferred technique. The hydrogeological data is often the basis for our design. What are the most important factors here, being hydraulic conductivity, the soil type, particle size, and then either literature data or results from field tests such as slug tests or pumping tests, or our own hands-on experience. We have been doing several projects all over the world, but especially in the Netherlands and Flanders, we have been doing projects in almost each type of common aquifer, so we more or less know what is possible within each aquifer. Those things are usually the basis for our design. What do I mean the basis for our design? Based on these parameters, if we know, for instance, the hydraulic conductivity, we can do some basic calculations for determining, for instance, the number of filters required. Based on a certain hydraulic conductivity, we can know the radius of influence. For instance, a radius of influence of 5 meters in a sandy aquifer is quite common. If we know this radius of influence and we know the area that we do need to treat, we can determine the amount of filters that we need to install to treat the full contaminated aquifer. Another basic rule of thumb that we are using is the number of infiltration versus extraction filters. As I said earlier on, typically for an in situ approach, we are extracting water in some wells. We are either dosing oxygen and nutrients or the carbon source above ground and then infiltrating it in other wells. Due to the nature and that we do not like to work under high pressure, we like to keep everything, we'd like to not disturb the aquifer. We, for instance, use the rule of thumb that in a sandy loam aquifer, we use about 3 infiltration filters for each extraction filter. If you know the number of filters and you know the number of extraction filters, you more or less know what the flow rate will be. So based on that, you can see, okay, typically, for instance, 100 liters per hour per well extracting, then you know how much liters per well you're being infiltrating, and you can determine the total amount of water that you're being pumping around, the cubic meters, so the flow rate. That's what the next logical calculation that is being followed. Then determining the time of the typical O&M time of a remediation, you set out a certain desired number of times of flushing of the aquifer. For instance, for a typical, not too much contaminated CVOC, where you have no DNAPL, for instance, You can use, you want to be flushing the pore volume, for instance, 10 times. So once you have the contaminated aquifer, you know your flow rates, you more or less can determine how long you will be expecting to run this installation. Then you still have some stuff like dosing, how much carbon source, how much nutrients do you want to be dosing. That's often based on detailed analysis when they are available, but also typical target concentrations. For instance, target DOC 300 milligrams a liter is quite common, and throwing all these basic calculations together gives you more or less a result on what your desired design, your basis for your remediation design can be. Of course, when we are drawing in a redevelopment, it's often a bit more complex because you cannot install filters at each location. Often in the previous example where we have the basic design, then you're assuming that all the filters can be installed in a nice grid. But when you're dealing with buildings or basements, things get a bit more complex. And then you can rely, or then you can include, for instance, hydraulic modeling. So in this case, it's a project example. There we tested out several design options to see which would be the best location for the different filters. How can we eliminate dead zones underneath buildings? Which flow rates do we maintain? Which flow rates can we achieve? Also to not impose any settling of the buildings, things like that. Predicting hotspots. So this hydraulic modeling can help, but one should always be aware that this is also just a model, and it's only the best we can do through computer modeling. So it's always just a reflection of what might be happening, but it does help to fine-tune a design. Moving on, it's something that's inherent with remediations, but typically with in situ remediation, and I think even more so with remediations combined with redevelopment, it's dealing with uncertainties. So how do we deal with these uncertainties? One of the key rules of thumb within GreenSoil is that we always try to rely on the cyclic design process. As I said earlier, the consultant often looks or is not able to do as much investigations of the source area as they would like to. When we are installing our in situ system, it's often the biggest fieldwork campaign that we are able to get during the remediation process or during the full contaminant project. So we really rely on all the data that we are getting during this installation phase, and we really use all this data to fine-tune our design. Furthermore, within the design, we try to maximize on flexibility. For instance, in the typical recirculation system, whenever we can, we try to make sure that we can use each filter for both extraction and infiltration. So we design the installation or the unit as such that we can switch around and that we are able to use each well as we would please. Also, by selecting filter lengths and filter locations, we make sure that we are able to allow recirculation within aquifers and in between aquifers. So what you'll often see is that an aquifer which is contaminated, for instance, from 2 to 10 meters below ground level, instead of installing filters from 2 till 10, we will often split it up from 2 till 6 and 6 till 10, for instance. That gives us some more flexibility. It does mean a higher installation cost, but it does also allow you during remediation, and once the installation or the remediation is ongoing, and based on monitoring results, you're still seeing some remaining hotspots. It allows you to really be flexible during the remediation. Another thing that we always try to take into account is an over design of the system, of course, to an acceptable level. But when, for instance, a slug test gives you a radius of influence of a possible radius of influence of 5 meters, we will try to push for a design, for instance, of a radius of influence of 4 meters, because more wells means more flexibility, and it will allow us more successful targeting of remaining hotspots at the end of the O&M phase. And another key takeaway, I think, is that we need to design for the best, but always prepare for the worst, and also communicate this to the client. We always prepare for longer O&M periods. We develop or we install our systems as such that they have a high expected life of operation. And we also take into account that additional remedial actions, for instance, direct push injections or direct filters injections, are things that could be necessary further down the road. And we try to take these additional remedial actions if they are required. We try to make sure that they don't interfere too much with our basic design. Then implementation phase, integrating bioremediation and redevelopment. I think just as during the investigation phase and during each big project, timing and communication is key. I think this cannot be stressed enough, but it will often mean the difference between a failure or success of a project. Communicating with the client, with all the stakeholders, it's really important, and being transparent in what you're doing, why you are doing some stuff. It's cannot be stressed enough. Then using treatment trains, as I explained earlier on. Some projects we try or we include, as you can see, several techniques: excavation combined with the soil vapor extraction, combined with the recirculation, combined with the biobarrier. Why we are opting for these treatment trains is, although they are often not or could be not the most financial feasible, they do allow us for eliminating uncertainties, and they do focus on eliminating the bulk of the contamination. And I think when you are able to remove a certain bulk of contamination within a short time frame, this may have an impact on the budget, but it may be, especially within a redevelopment project, it may be the preferred solution. So I think that's something that we, whenever we are looking at redevelopment projects, we see that these treatment trains are more common than when we are doing remediations just on active sites, for instance, and when they are not combined with redevelopment. So I think that's something to focus on. Also from a consultant point of view, do not focus on just one technique, but make sure to think a bit out of the box and see how you can use several techniques to your advantage. And then, another thing that we pride ourselves on is the underground installations of all the filters and the piping. I'll show it in the project examples as well. But these do show that we can install a system underground, and that these do not have to interfere with the redevelopment plans of the location of a site. Okay, that's a bit for the theory. I hope it was a bit useful for some of you. It has been a bit back to basics, but I did try to include some rules of thumbs. Now I want to move to the two projects. As I said earlier, these projects have been presented in the past as well. So I'll try to keep it short and summary, because I see that we're already quite a long way into the presentation. Should you require additional background of these projects, then please get in touch or visit our other webinars. The first project is in Mechelen, where we have been doing the remediation of a former metal treatment company. They had been active until 2012. Soil and groundwater was impacted with chlorinated solvents until 16 meters. Quite large contamination, where a hydraulic barrier had been operating during almost 12 years. Resulted in a minimal mass removal, and there was really not a source identified. So it was a typical CVOC contamination, where we did have a good idea of what the plume of the contamination was, but where the source was not really clear. Quite some project history, as I said, a pump and treat. and followed by closure of the site, new remedial assessment, and then we came into the picture around 2016, where we were able to provide the client with a result-driven contract. So a risk-based contract where we are being paid when we receive certain milestones. And we started the remediation in 2017, and we are moving towards the end of the project, as being shown by the results in the next slide. This is an overview of the contamination, the CVOC plume in groundwater. It's the contour shown here, and the design that we proposed to implement. After some additional investigation, we were also able to identify the source areas, and here are some pictures of the different techniques that we implemented here. The source areas, they were excavated. Then we installed quite a dense recirculation system, as was shown in the previous slide. And in between the different filters, or the recirculation filters, we have been dosing additional carbon source through direct push. And these direct push injections, they are just there to speed up the flushing of the aquifer. So these are not required. We would achieve the set out results as well by just using the recirculation, but by dosing additional carbon source in between the different filters, you're effectively shortening the time frame required for the full flushing of the aquifer. As you can see in the pictures, we also installed all the piping underground, and all the filters have been finished below ground at a depth about 1.5 meters below ground level. This is the site, some more pictures during the O&M of the works. And then here you'll see a schematic of the typical recirculation. So in the next animation, you will see groundwater being extracted from the extraction well, being pushed through the remediation system, carbon source being added, and then once again being infiltrated in the infiltration well. So it's being shown in this schematic, just to show how how simple this system really is. It's not really complex. The complexity lies in making sure that you are able to treat the whole aquifer, and making sure that when you're operating such a unit during several years, that your maintenance is on point, that you are not you're not clogging filters, you're not losing money by reinstalling new wells, things like that. So that's where the expertise lies. Then some results. So this was, as I indicated earlier, the contour of the perchloro and trichloroethylene at the start of our project. And you'll see that during the years, these concentrations diminished. And this is also where the flexibility of our system comes into play. Once these areas are no longer under or no longer above our target values, we are able to stop treating certain times or shutting down certain parts of our remediation system and focus on the remaining hotspots and more intensely flush, for instance, those locations. So I think allowing the flexibility and taking into account this flexibility during the design phase is really important. As you can see, in the past 2 years, we did not have any exceedances anymore of our target values of our mother product. As we explained earlier, that the degradation pathways, it starts from the mother product and results in the formation of a dichloroethylene and vinyl chloride to the daughter products. Also here you will see a shrinking, but it's slower, or it follows after the degradation of the mother product. You'll see some contours, and you'll see the remaining hotspots that need to be treated in these final steps. Of course, we are not only monitoring on our infiltration and recirculation filters, which are the basis for these contours, where we are able to sample water coming in and going into each well in our remediation unit. But we are also, of course, sampling the monitoring wells in between these recirculation wells, and those are the results that you're showing in these graphs. Once again, you'll see the clear degradation of the mother product, the tetrachloroethane, the blue one in the graphs, and slowly forming these degradation products such as dichloroethene and vinyl chloride. And the graphs still show that we do have some work, but things are moving along quite nicely. And yeah, the redevelopment of the site is already ongoing. We are still remediating, or still active on location. As you can see, this building has been installed on top of our remediation system, and we were able to really successfully integrate a redevelopment within a remediation. Moving on to the second project, the project in Geel, also another one which we have been which we are quite proud of and which we have presented in the past, so maybe quite familiar to some of you. The former telecommunications site, where we have once again a contamination with CVOCs. During the investigation phase, we had limited degradation products. Contamination was present until depths of 21 meters, and we identified 2 source zones and the typical long contaminant plume, which shows that the typical CVOC spreading. So moving down gradient of these 2 source areas in the more permeable layers. Important to know here is that one of the challenges of this project were the glauconite iron sands, which have a very low buffering capacity, and which was also one of the reasons why earlier bioremediations in the past were unsuccessful. So also this project has a quite large history. Once again, I'm trying to keep things short today, so I'm not going into too much detail here. But previous remediation activities on location were unsuccessful. The site owner and the liable party had conflicting interests, and it seemed that the project was in a standstill. We were able to offer a fixed price solution, and we were able to transfer the remediation obligation from the liable party to GreenSoil. So for this project, we really had a typical contract where no longer the liable party would be liable for remediation, but this was being transferred to GreenSoil. The remedial design also, once again, here we included the typical treatment train. So we had an excavation of the 2 source areas. Then we have an intensified source recirculation, so the stimulating of the anaerobic degradation within the two source areas. The first source area where we have 4 deep wells and 13 injection wells. The second source area where we have 6 extraction wells and 37 injection wells. Important to point out here is that here we did opt for not the typical recirculation where each filter could be recirculating and infiltrating, but here we wanted to achieve higher flow rates, and that's why we opted for deep wells. And then for the plume approach, we opted for the recirculation by using biobarriers and having deep wells in between the biobarriers to allow for a more sped up flushing of these plume areas as well. Yeah, we had quite some technical challenges. The site owner had the intention of installing a windmill on top of the source contamination. So this was quite challenging, but yeah, it could also be a win-win. So by combining the excavation and the construction, yeah, we were able to create a financial interesting result for all involved parties. The other challenge was, okay, these windmills, they need quite some foundations. How do we make sure that our in situ system is still accessible? this required quite some detailed engineering and design, but we were able to come up with a nice solution, and we were really able to integrate the redevelopment plans within the scheduled remediation. So this is the above picture is a picture of the in situ system within the excavation area. The other one is where with all the black circumferences are the different extraction wells, which are pointing out of the foundation, the metal piling for the base of the windmill. So it was it's quite a nice sight to see, and a nice piece of engineering. Some pictures of the biobarriers, where we installed the biobarriers underground, just as in the Mechelen project. So all the piping has been installed underground, and then we also have a short movie clip of the presentation, which I will show now, where it summarizes our efforts on this location. So it starts off with an aerial view where we will see the two excavation pits. So the first source zone has been excavated till 9 meters with an in situ system until 21 meters. To allow for this this excavation, we did need quite some stringent stability measures and a large groundwater treatment system. We were able to treat flow rates up to 50 cubic meters an hour. You can see the second source area and excavation until 9 meters, and then an in situ system until 21 meters. So as you can see, it's quite a challenging condition, and not so straightforward at all. The windmill construction on top of the remediation system. Some more pictures of the metal sheet piling. And then I think to conclude, some photos of the biobarriers as well, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. To finalize and to more or less move to the end of this presentation, I want to show you some results. So the contaminant plume, the contour you're seeing now is the TCE plume, which has now been switched out for the measured TOC concentrations. And as we said earlier, allow flexibility within your system. It's more or less what's being showcased by the following graphs. So in the beginning, we opted to really recirculate within the source areas and to make sure that we were able to dose as much as possible carbon source within those two areas. Recirculation at source zone 1, source zone 2, and at the first biobarrier. And afterwards, we started playing a bit with this aquifer, where we decided, okay, we now see elevated TOC concentrations and first biodegradation signs within these source areas. This could be a good moment to also do some more extraction and more spreading of TOC within the plume and within the biobarriers. And this is being showcased by these graphs, these flow lines, which are being modeled in the hydraulic modeling software. And this is also being reflected in the evolution of the TOC. So at first you'll see that these TOC concentrations are more localized to the first biobarrier and the two source areas. And afterwards you see that it's all spreading out. Once we start being more flexible and once we are able to more flush this aquifer. Moving to the more traditional monitoring results in 2016, you'll see that there's a large plume with PCE and TCE, and at some certain spots you'll see the formation of these daughter products. once we are busy with the remediation, you'll see that quite quickly these contaminants of mother products, these plumes have been cut into pieces, and that you'll see the increase of the formation of these of these daughter products, and that's also being showcased in these monitoring graphs of the monitoring filters, where you'll see the clear degradation of trichloro and tetrachloroethane to dichloroethane and vinyl chloride. And the reason why we were able to do this at this location and why it did not succeed in the past was that the pH drop that is being typical when you're dosing typical carbon sources. We did not observe it at this location due to our properties of the halo, and specifically this aquifer, the Glauconite aquifer, is really sensitive to these pH drop because it has almost no buffering capacity, and that's why one of the reasons why the biodegradation in the past was unsuccessful, and we were able to turn it around. And that concludes my presentation. Okay, Michaela.
Thank you, Jan. Bit out of time, but
yeah, sorry.
More as I didn't see any question popping up. Just want to repeat, as you already mentioned, that this topic was already presented last year. I think was our third webinar after the starting of the pandemic. But it was a request of our attendees of the last webinars we had to discuss again the combination of redevelopment and remediation. That's why we proposed this topic again. However, we wanted to look at it from a different point of view. So Jan spent quite some time at the beginning of the webinar discussing different aspects of these projects. I don't see any questions, so I guess you were pretty clear.
Okay, nice to hear.
Anyway, if you have any question later on in the next days, just drop us an email. Here you can see our contact details. You can also see the contact details of the director of our Brazilian office, Sergio Verissimo, and the rest of the sales team is also in this last slide. I will share with all of you the recording of this webinar. And if you want the PDF, just send us an email and I will forward you the PDF of the presentation. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Last question. If we have any similar project in Chile.
Say again, Michaela?
Do we have any similar project in Chile?
I don't think we have a similar project ongoing at this moment in Chile, no. I will get
working on.
I will get in touch with Martin or Sergio to make sure that I'm not saying any mistakes.
No, you're not mistaking.
Okay.
We are not. We at the moment currently we don't have any active project in Chile where we have the combination of redevelopment and remediation. But we are working and we hope to implement it in the near future, let's say.
Yeah, I know we are looking at one project at the moment, but yeah, I'm not up to speed with that one, so.
No. Close your mouth now. Okay. Again, thank you everybody for joining us from different parts of the world. See Canada, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Europe. Thank you very much. So also people that were not registered. So I don't know if you're going to receive my email with the recording. If not, please send me a private email and I forward you the recording. And see you to the next webinar. Have a nice day.
Okay, thanks, Michaela. Thanks you all, participants.